The day a billion-dollar trucking company began begging for help, the only man who could save it was the one they had rejected 7 times. The crisis started on a gray Thursday morning at Redwood Freight Systems headquarters outside St. Louis. By 8:15 a.m., 3,000 shipping containers were sitting motionless across distribution yards in 4 states. By 9 a.m., retailers were calling nonstop. By 9:40 a.m., contract penalties had already crossed 7 figures. And by 10 a.m., every executive in the boardroom understood the same frightening truth. Their logistics network was breaking apart faster than anyone could stop it. Victoria Hayes stood at the far end of the conference table, arms folded, eyes fixed on a wall-sized operations screen filled with flashing alerts. At 32 years old, she had spent the last 4 years transforming Redwood Freight into one of the fastest-growing transportation companies in the Midwest. Investors admired her discipline. Competitors respected her ambition. Employees knew she demanded excellence. What nobody in that room knew yet was that every decision she had made over the previous 2 years was about to lead back to one man. The screen updated again. Another carrier had suspended operations. A major distribution partner had missed delivery targets across 200 routes. Fuel contracts were being disrupted. Warehouses were reaching capacity. The room grew quieter with every update. Nobody wanted to say what everyone was thinking. Finally, the head of operations cleared his throat. "We've exhausted every available carrier in the region." Silence followed. Then a board member leaned forward. "What about Carter Freight?" The room froze. Victoria said nothing. The name hung in the air like a challenge nobody wanted to touch. Across the table, another executive lowered his eyes. A third shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Everyone knew the story. Everyone knew the number. 7. 7 times Ethan Carter had requested a partnership meeting. 7 times Redwood Freight had declined. 7 proposals. 7 rejections. 7 closed doors. Victoria remembered every one of them. A small independent fleet owner. A single father. No major investors. No flashy headquarters. No national reputation. Just a quiet man with a growing transportation company and an unusual confidence that never seemed to fade, no matter how many times he heard the word no. At the time, rejecting him had felt logical, necessary even. But now another alert appeared on the screen. Another route failure. Another delay. Another customer threatening to walk away. The operations director looked directly at Victoria. "If Carter Freight says no now, we may not have enough capacity to recover before next week." Outside the boardroom windows, trucks moved across the massive shipping yard below. Inside, nobody spoke for several long seconds. Then the chairman asked the question Victoria never expected to hear. "Has anyone managed to reach Ethan Carter?" 18 months earlier, nobody at Redwood Freight had paid much attention to Ethan Carter. The first time he walked into the company headquarters, he arrived 15 minutes early carrying a simple leather folder and wearing a clean work jacket instead of an expensive suit. He drove himself there in a pickup truck with nearly 200,000 miles on the odometer. The receptionist assumed he was a delivery contractor. The junior managers assumed he was looking for subcontract work. Nobody bothered to ask many questions. Ethan did not seem offended by any of it. He simply sat in the waiting area and reviewed his notes while a photograph of his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, rested inside the folder beside his proposal. At that point, Carter Freight operated only 12 trucks across Missouri and Illinois. It was a small company by industry standards. But Ethan had spent years studying shipping patterns, warehouse congestion, driver shortages, and regional freight capacity. He believed a major shift was coming. Most executives did not. When the meeting finally happened, Ethan spoke calmly for 20 minutes. He explained how supply routes were becoming too dependent on a handful of giant carriers. He explained how regional networks could become more reliable if they were built differently. He explained how Redwood could reduce risk by partnering with smaller fleets before market conditions changed. Victoria Hayes listened politely. Then she declined. The company preferred larger partners. Ethan thanked her for her time and left without argument. 6 weeks later, he came back with updated numbers. The answer was still no. 3 months after that, he returned with new route analysis. Another no, then another, then another, then another. By the 7th meeting, several executives already recognized him the moment he entered the building. One manager jokingly referred to him as the most persistent fleet owner in the Midwest. Ethan smiled when he heard it. He never appeared frustrated. He never raised his voice. He never tried to pressure anyone. During the 7th rejection, Victoria sat across from him in the same conference room and explained that Redwood had finalized long-term agreements with national transportation providers. There was no room for Carter Freight. Ethan listened quietly. Then he closed his folder and stood. For a moment, Victoria thought he might finally argue his case. Instead, he simply nodded. "I understand," he said. "I hope your partners can deliver what they promised." There was nothing dramatic about the sentence, yet something about the way he said it lingered after he left the room. Victoria dismissed the feeling and moved on to her next meeting. What nobody inside Redwood knew was that Ethan had already begun building something much larger than the company they imagined. And after the 7th rejection, he stopped asking for a seat at their table entirely. Ethan Carter's life did not look like the life of a man building a transportation empire. Every morning began at 5:30 before sunrise. He packed a lunch for Lily, checked the weather reports across 3 states, reviewed driver schedules, and made breakfast in a small house on the edge of Columbia, Missouri. The kitchen table carried more route maps than decorations. The refrigerator held school drawings attached with magnets and handwritten notes reminding him about parent-teacher conferences and soccer practice. To most people, Ethan appeared ordinary. That was exactly how he preferred it. Lily was 8 now and possessed the quiet confidence often seen in children who trust the person raising them completely. She asked thoughtful questions and listened carefully to the answers. One morning, while finishing a bowl of cereal, she looked at a photograph lying beside Ethan's laptop. It showed a large warehouse with dozens of trucks parked outside. "Is that one of yours?" she asked. Ethan glanced at the picture. "Yes." Lily studied it for a moment. "How many trucks do you have now?" Ethan smiled slightly. "Enough." That answer seemed to satisfy her. It would not have satisfied anyone else. Over the previous 18 months, Carter Freight had grown in ways almost nobody noticed. Ethan purchased equipment gradually. 1 truck became 3. 3 became 7. 7 became 15. He acquired routes that larger companies ignored because the profit margins looked too small. He hired experienced drivers who had grown tired of corporate bureaucracy. He invested in reliability instead of advertising. While competitors spent money on image, Ethan spent money on maintenance, fuel efficiency, dispatch systems, and relationships with warehouse operators. Most importantly, he listened. Drivers talked. Dispatchers talked. Dock managers talked. Ethan paid attention. Patterns began emerging long before the industry noticed them. He saw growing dependence on a handful of national carriers. He saw labor shortages spreading through distribution networks. He saw freight bottlenecks forming around major transportation hubs. The same warning signs he had tried to explain during those 7 meetings continued appearing everywhere. One afternoon, Ethan stood beside a loading yard, watching the trailers depart beneath a cloudy sky. His operations manager, Caleb Turner, walked over carrying a tablet. "We picked up another regional contract this morning," Caleb said. Ethan nodded. "How many routes does that add?" 26. Ethan looked toward the highway beyond the property line. Trucks moved steadily in both directions. Commerce never stopped. The country depended on movement more than most people realized. After a few seconds, Caleb asked the question many people had been asking privately for months. "Do you ever regret those meetings with Redwood?" Ethan considered the question carefully. Then he shook his head. "No." "Not even after 7 rejections?" Ethan watched one of his drivers pull onto the interstate before answering. "Sometimes people need to learn what a thing is worth before they recognize it." While Ethan Carter expanded carefully across the Midwest, Victoria Hayes was fighting a different battle inside Redwood Freight. Success had come quickly, but growth carried its own pressure. Every quarter brought new expectations from investors. Every expansion required larger contracts. Every board meeting demanded bigger numbers than the one before it. At first, the strategy appeared flawless. Redwood partnered with several of the largest transportation providers in the country. The agreements looked impressive on paper: national coverage, massive capacity, strong financial backing. The board approved every major deal. Analysts praised the company's direction. Victoria became known as one of the rising leaders in the industry. Yet beneath the surface, small problems had already begun appearing. Routes that once had backup options now depended on a single provider. Regional flexibility disappeared as more operations became centralized. When delays occurred, solutions took longer to find. Most executives considered these issues temporary growing pains. Victoria did too. During one operations review, a senior logistics analyst named Daniel Brooks presented a report showing increasing dependence on several major carriers. The presentation lasted less than 15 minutes. Most executives focused on revenue projections instead. Daniel quietly returned to his seat. Months later, another report arrived. Driver shortages were spreading faster than expected. Insurance costs were climbing. Equipment availability was tightening across multiple states. Again, the concerns were noted but not prioritized. The company was growing. Growth made it easy to ignore warning signs. One evening, Victoria remained alone in the office long after sunset. The city lights reflected against the glass walls surrounding her executive suite. Contracts covered her desk. Forecasts filled her monitor. She rubbed her eyes and reviewed next year's expansion plans. Redwood intended to move into several new distribution corridors. The opportunity was enormous. So was the risk. For a brief moment, she remembered Ethan Carter. Not because of anything dramatic. Simply because his proposals had focused on resilience rather than growth. Flexibility rather than scale. Local strength rather than national reach. She remembered the calm way he had spoken during those meetings. The thought lasted only a few seconds before another call pulled her attention elsewhere. The next morning, Redwood announced another major partnership. Investors celebrated. Industry publications praised the deal. The stock price moved higher. Everything appeared to be working exactly as planned. Meanwhile, 200 miles away, Ethan stood in a newly acquired operations center, watching dispatch screens track dozens of active routes. He was not thinking about Redwood. He was reviewing weather patterns, fuel costs, and warehouse schedules, one challenge at a time, one decision at a time, one truck at a time. The gap between the two companies continued widening, though neither side understood how important that gap would soon become. Because while Redwood was building a larger system, Ethan was building a stronger one. And in the transportation business, those two things were not always the same. The warning arrived almost a year before the crisis. Ethan noticed it during a routine review of freight reports spread across his desk after Lily had gone to bed. Most people would have missed it. The numbers looked healthy on the surface. Shipping volume was increasing. Consumer demand remained strong. Large carriers continued announcing expansion plans. But hidden underneath the growth was something else. Delivery times were becoming less predictable. Backup capacity was shrinking. More freight was being concentrated into fewer hands. Ethan leaned back in his chair and stared at the maps pinned along the wall. Every route told a story. Every delay pointed toward a weakness. The industry was becoming efficient in ways that looked impressive during good times and dangerous during difficult ones. The next morning, he called a meeting with his leadership team. Caleb Turner arrived first, then dispatch supervisors, then regional managers joining through video calls. Ethan spent an hour walking them through projections, rising costs, driver shortages, capacity constraints, growing dependence on a handful of transportation giants. When he finished, the room remained quiet. Finally, Caleb spoke. "How long before this becomes a problem?" Ethan looked at the charts again. "It already is a problem. Most companies just have not felt it yet." That answer shaped every decision Carter Freight made afterward. While competitors chased rapid expansion, Ethan invested in redundancy. He acquired additional yard space. He signed agreements with independent maintenance providers across multiple states. He expanded driver training programs. He built relationships with smaller warehouse operators that larger companies ignored. Some investors questioned the strategy. Several opportunities promised faster profits. Ethan declined them. He was not building for the next quarter. He was building for the next decade. Months passed. Then the first signs appeared. A regional carrier unexpectedly suspended operations. Another struggled to replace retiring drivers. Fuel volatility disrupted planning across several transportation networks. Industry conferences filled with discussions about efficiency. Ethan noticed very few conversations about resilience. One afternoon, Caleb walked into Ethan's office carrying an industry publication. A major article praised Redwood Freight's aggressive growth strategy. The cover featured Victoria Hayes, standing beside a fleet of branded trailers. Caleb placed the magazine on the desk. "Looks like they are winning." Ethan glanced at the cover before returning to a route schedule. "Maybe." Caleb waited. "That is all you have to say?" Ethan smiled faintly. Success and stability are not always the same thing. Later that evening, Lily sat beside him at the kitchen table, working on a school project while Ethan reviewed dispatch reports. She looked up from her notebook. "Daddy, why do you always make extra plans?" Ethan considered the question carefully. "Because someday one of the first plans might stop working." Lily nodded as though the answer made perfect sense. In many ways it did. Because while much of the industry was preparing for growth, Ethan was quietly preparing for disruption. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the disruption was already beginning to move toward them. The disruption arrived quietly at first. No headlines, no dramatic announcements, just a series of small failures scattered across the transportation network. A carrier in Kansas reported driver shortages severe enough to delay dozens of routes. A major warehouse outside Indianapolis reduced operating hours because staffing levels could not keep pace with demand. Fuel suppliers began adjusting delivery schedules. None of these problems seemed catastrophic on their own. Together, they formed something much more dangerous. Inside Redwood Freight, executives spent weeks managing one issue after another. Every time a problem appeared resolved, two more surfaced somewhere else. Victoria Hayes sat through meeting after meeting as reports accumulated across her desk. Delivery delays, capacity shortages, missed pickup windows, customer complaints. The company remained profitable, but the margin for error was shrinking. During one operations review, Daniel Brooks projected a map onto the conference room screen. Red indicators appeared across multiple states. The room grew noticeably quieter. "What are we looking at?" Victoria asked. Daniel hesitated before answering. "The same pattern we have been tracking for months. Regional instability is spreading." Another executive shook his head. "Temporary disruption." Daniel did not argue. Instead, he changed slides. The next image showed something more troubling. Several of Redwood's largest transportation partners were handling record volumes while simultaneously reporting declining flexibility. Backup capacity had nearly disappeared. If one major provider encountered trouble, there would be very few alternatives available. Victoria studied the numbers carefully. For the first time, the situation felt less theoretical. Later that afternoon, she stood alone in her office overlooking the shipping yard below. Hundreds of trailers moved through the facility every day. Everything depended on movement. Everything depended on timing. Yet the system suddenly felt more fragile than it ever had before. 200 miles away, Carter Freight continued operating normally. Ethan spent most mornings reviewing route performance before drivers departed. Trucks rolled out of multiple yards across several states. Dispatch teams communicated smoothly. Maintenance schedules remained ahead of projections. The company was busy but controlled. One evening, Caleb entered Ethan's office carrying several industry reports. "You should see this," he said. Ethan reviewed the documents quietly. Another carrier reducing service. Another distribution partner struggling with capacity. Another logistics firm postponing expansion plans. None of it surprised him. "It is starting," Caleb said. Ethan nodded. "Yes." "How bad do you think it gets?" Ethan looked through the office window toward rows of parked tractors illuminated by yard lights. "That depends on how many companies built their business assuming nothing would ever go wrong." The next morning, Lily climbed into the passenger seat while Ethan drove her to school. She looked out the window at several Carter freight trucks passing in the opposite direction. "They always know where to go," she said. Ethan smiled. "That is because somebody plans ahead." Neither of them knew it yet. But before long, one of the largest companies in the region would discover exactly how valuable that simple habit could be. By the time the crisis reached its peak, Redwood Freight was no longer searching for solutions. It was searching for capacity. The difference mattered. Capacity meant trucks, drivers, routes, warehouses, real infrastructure that could move products from one place to another. And suddenly, there was not enough of it anywhere. Victoria Hayes sat through 3 emergency meetings in a single day. Every major transportation provider they contacted gave the same answer: limited availability, delayed timelines, reduced service commitments. Some carriers stopped returning calls altogether. Others offered partial solutions that would cover only a fraction of what Redwood needed. The numbers grew worse every hour. Customers who had trusted Redwood for years were demanding answers. Distribution schedules were slipping. Contract penalties were increasing. The company was still standing, but the pressure was becoming impossible to ignore. During an emergency board session, Daniel Brooks projected a list of regional transportation networks still operating at full capacity. The list was surprisingly short. Several names disappeared after verification. Others lacked sufficient coverage. Then only one remained: Carter Freight. Nobody spoke immediately. The silence felt different this time. Not uncomfortable, unavoidable. One board member leaned forward. "How many trucks are they operating now?" Daniel checked his tablet. "More than we estimated." "How many?" Another pause. "At least 140 active units across multiple states." Several executives exchanged surprised looks. The number was far larger than anyone expected. Victoria stared at the screen. 140. The man she had once viewed as a small independent operator now controlled one of the most flexible regional fleets in the Midwest. Daniel continued. They have available yard space. Their maintenance metrics are among the best in the region. Their driver retention is unusually high. Their delivery reliability remains above industry average. Every sentence made the room quieter. Across town, calls began moving through Redwood's executive offices. Procurement teams reached out. Operations managers reached out. Regional directors reached out. Nobody could get Ethan Carter directly. He was busy, not avoiding them, simply working. Meanwhile, Ethan spent the afternoon visiting one of Carter Freight's newest facilities outside Springfield. Drivers moved through the yard. Dispatch teams coordinated routes. Mechanics completed inspections. The operation ran with the calm rhythm of something built carefully over many years. Caleb approached carrying his phone. You might want to see this. Ethan glanced at the screen. 12 missed calls. 4 voicemails. Multiple emails from Redwood Freight executives. He handed the phone back. Looks important. Caleb laughed softly. You are taking this remarkably well. Ethan looked across the yard where several trucks were preparing to depart before sunrise. Nothing has changed. Caleb raised an eyebrow. Ethan nodded toward the operations surrounding them. We still have freight to move tomorrow. That evening, while helping Lily with homework at the kitchen table, Ethan's phone rang again. This time, the caller identification displayed a name he recognized immediately. Victoria Hayes. The phone continued ringing quietly between them. Lily looked up from her workbook. Are you going to answer? Ethan studied the screen for a moment. Then he set the phone down and returned his attention to her math assignment. Not yet. Victoria Hayes arrived at the Carter Freight Operations Center just after sunrise the following morning. She had expected something modest, perhaps a regional dispatch office, a handful of trucks, a successful small business that had grown beyond expectations. What she found instead forced her to reconsider nearly everything she thought she knew about Ethan Carter. The facility stretched across more than 40 acres on the edge of the interstate. Rows of tractors stood organized with military precision. Maintenance bays operated at full capacity. Drivers moved through the yard carrying tablets and route manifests. Dispatch screens visible through the operations building windows tracked freight movement across multiple states. The entire place carried an atmosphere she recognized immediately. Competence. Not the kind displayed in presentations or investor reports. The quieter kind. The kind built through thousands of correct decisions repeated over many years. Victoria stepped out of her vehicle and simply looked around. One of Carter Freight's managers greeted her politely and escorted her through the facility. Every answer generated more questions. How many active routes? More than 800 each week. Driver retention, among the highest in the region. On-time delivery rates, consistently exceeding industry averages. Backup capacity, far greater than most national competitors. Victoria listened carefully. With every number, the gap between perception and reality widened. For nearly 2 years, she had viewed Ethan Carter as a small operator seeking an opportunity. The truth was far different. He had never been trying to join someone else's success. He had been building his own. They eventually reached an elevated observation platform overlooking the main yard. From there, Victoria could see wave after wave of equipment preparing for departure. White trailers bearing the Carter Freight logo stretched toward the horizon. New equipment sat beside older units maintained in remarkable condition. Nothing looked flashy. Everything looked purposeful. "How many trucks are operating today?" she asked quietly. The manager checked his tablet. 146 active units. Victoria remained silent. A year earlier, she would have considered that impossible. At the same moment, Ethan stood inside a conference room reviewing route forecasts with Caleb and several regional supervisors. He knew Victoria had arrived. Nobody needed to tell him. Yet he continued working through the morning schedule without interruption. Freight still needed moving. Customers still needed service. Responsibilities came before emotions. Eventually, Caleb glanced toward the window overlooking the yard. "She has been here almost an hour." Ethan finished reviewing a report before responding. "Has she?" Caleb laughed softly. "Most people would make her wait longer." Ethan closed the folder. This was never about making anyone wait. A few minutes later, he stepped outside. Across the yard, Victoria Hayes stood watching dozens of Carter freight trucks roll toward the interstate. For the first time since the crisis began, she was no longer looking at a company she could ignore. She was looking at the foundation that had survived the very storm threatening to break her own. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Trucks continued rolling through the yard behind them. Drivers checked schedules, dispatchers coordinated routes, and the steady rhythm of work carried on exactly as it had before Victoria Hayes arrived. Ethan Carter walked over and stopped beside her at the observation platform. His expression remained calm. The same expression he had carried through 7 rejections, 2 years of growth, and every challenge in between. Victoria looked across the rows of equipment before finally speaking. "I was wrong." Ethan did not rush to answer. "About what?" She gave a small laugh at the question. "About you. About your company. About what you were trying to tell us." Ethan rested his hands on the railing and watched another group of trucks leave the yard. "A lot of people made the same mistake. You never seemed angry. Being angry would not have moved a single shipment." The honesty of the answer left her quiet for a moment. Back at Redwood Freight, executives were waiting for updates. Customers were waiting for answers. Investors were waiting for reassurance. Yet standing there, Victoria realized the crisis had started long before the delayed deliveries. It had started when she chose scale over resilience, growth over preparation, assumptions over observation. "We need your help," she said finally. Ethan nodded once, not surprised, not triumphant, simply acknowledging reality. "I know." Victoria turned toward him. "Can Carter Freight handle the volume?" Ethan looked toward the dispatch center where route maps covered an entire wall of screens. "Yes." The answer came without hesitation. "Under one condition." Victoria waited. "This has to be a partnership, not a rescue, not a temporary favor. A partnership." She understood immediately. 2 years earlier, she had viewed him as someone asking for an opportunity. Now she was speaking with an equal, maybe more than an equal. Someone who had seen the future of the industry before. Most executives recognized the warning signs. "Agreed," she said. Ethan extended his hand. Victoria shook it. The agreement took less than 5 seconds. Building the trust behind it had taken years. 3 weeks later, freight delays across Redwood's network had dropped dramatically. Customers remained. Major contracts were preserved. Industry analysts praised the recovery effort. Most of them never understood how close the company had come to a far different outcome. On a Saturday morning shortly after, Ethan stood beside Lily at a community soccer field while trucks continued moving freight across the Midwest. His phone remained silent. No emergencies, no urgent meetings. Just a normal morning. Lily looked up at him while holding a juice box. Was that the lady who kept saying no? Ethan smiled. Yes. Lily thought about that for a moment. She says yes now. Ethan watched the game begin on the field ahead. Sometimes people need time to see what was right in front of them. Then he folded his chair open, sat beside his daughter, and quietly enjoyed the rest of the morning.